2. And I think our legal officer is going to speak.
Thank you. Members, just to confirm that Councillor Harford will be taking the place of the chair effectively in respect of the remaining part of the committee. That is because of a combination of factors, which was that the chair both had another appointment but also considered that there may well be a perception of bias in respect of these matters, therefore decided not to sit on them.
Thank you very much. So we move to both agenda item 5 and 6. We're going to take these together in respect of the presentation by the officer and the debate, but we will, because they're both the same, just on different pieces of land, and then we'll vote separately on the 2 items. So, okay with members? So these are both Section 73 applications to develop land without complying with conditions of the planning permissions that they've had before for a wood waste recycling facility at Unit 1, 35 Benwick Road, Industrial Estate, Whittlesea. And in both cases, the officer recommendation is that planning approval should be granted, subject to the conditions that are set out on each report. Ms. Vass, please.
Thank you, Councillor Harford. Yeah, as you've already explained, both applications are to extend the duration of a temporary permission for another 5 years, and they make up a single site. So I will just say things once. In respect of the first application, I'll call it the main site. That's the area that was granted planning permission 5 years ago, and there was access through the industrial estate onto Benwick Road. This drawing is in your agenda, which shows the original main site, and then in 2016 planning permission was granted for an extension to that site and also a workshop, which I can show later. Also in the report we make reference to a haulage yard, of which there is no physical separation between the extension area and the haulage yard. It can be accessed that way. And the applicants have most recently said they don't consider that that forms part of the waste recycling site. We'll come back to that. Aerial photograph of the site, that's the main yard. The extension area takes it, permitted extension area, takes it down to about the level of the bottom of that building, and the haulage yard would be in that area. And access is from Benwick Road through the industrial yard to a gateway about there. Obviously, it's surrounded by industrial units, and there is residential property just about opposite the site access. That is looking up with your back to Benwick Road, fairly near the top of the industrial estate. That's the main entrance into the wood yard. You can see, yeah, processed wood. If you keep your eye on that yellow container, the haulage yard is off to the left. And that shows the yellow container, and this is the haulage yard, so you're sort of looking perpendicular. The main yard is that way, and the boundary would sort of run along there, and there's no physical separation at the moment. That's just a typical view within the yard, unprocessed wood being reduced in size down to the product that leaves the site. And again, similar wood stockpiles and the weighbridge. And that's the workshop building that was granted planning permission in 2016. And finally, with your back to the wood waste site, looking back down through the industrial estate to the shared access towards Benwick Road. As I said before, both applications are to seek an extension of time for a time-limited planning permission. And I think you'll pick up from the report that the use of land, if carried out in accordance with the planning conditions, and noting also that the operation is subject to an environmental permit, the use of land is capable of being carried out without causing unacceptable harm to the environment or the occupiers of neighbouring premises. The development would recycle waste and can contribute to the sustainable management of waste. comply with development plan policy, so officers consider there is no reason not to support it in principle. I've referred to the status of the haulage yard, and we think that needs to be considered. The applicant has most recently said that it's not part of their wood recycling site, so we're recommending that a permanent physical barrier be installed to define the two planning uses. At the moment, it'd be quite hard to determine where one stops and the other one starts. So we're recommending conditions on both of the applications accordingly. And we're also recommending a condition requiring the operator to record HGV movements to assist in the assist them to demonstrate they're complying with one of the other conditions. That's all I've got to say. I think the comments apply equally to both applications, and I think, as you've been advised, you'll take a vote on them separately.
Thank you. I just wanted to check this first. On paragraph 6.8 of number 5, you're referring to the enforcement team. And I just wanted to clarify that. I'll just read it. It just says, the enforcement team continues to receive complaints about overnight HGV movements associated with the site, along with complaints about general working hours, dust and the heights of stockpiles. But the site currently operates without a live planning permission, and therefore there are no planning conditions to enforce against. So my question is, are we in the position then that the only way that we could take enforcement action is if the applications to extend the use of the site are approved?
Well, if they're refused, the applicant would have the usual right of appeal, but if they were unsuccessful and planning permission wasn't granted either by ourselves or on appeal, the continued use of it for waste recycling would be a breach of planning control, and then we'd be open to take enforcement action.
Can I just ask Emma, please, or somebody explain, so this site currently operates without a live planning permission. So I take it the planning permission has finished, expired.
They expired in June, and the application...
In June?
Yeah.
The application arrived?
In May. Oh, it was certainly before the expiry date. Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned that the haulage yard section of the site isn't a part of the application or isn't being considered as such, and you would recommend some kind of physical separation between the two. So I don't see that in any of the conditioning associated with it, unless I've missed it somewhere.
On one, it's, I think, recommended condition 14. And,
Okay.
One
I think I'm actually looking at the first application of the two, to be honest.
should be on both. But the numbers are out.
Page 90 of your report shows condition 14.
Yeah, condition 13, yeah.
I thought I missed it, thank you.
There's a lot of paperwork.
Chair, so just that I'm coming to page 87, and I've got this thing about, they haven't got planning permission at the minute, but they're still working, but they put the application in before, so I was putting, yeah, okay. But the local community, and business and residents, you know, are really, really, really concerned about past performance of the operator. I know we can't have it into consideration, Emma, I understand that, but I think it's something we should think about. I mean, if in the past they haven't gone with the conditions of planning that this authority puts on their business, what's the point of having planning conditions? And what can we do to ensure that, one, they build that fence, Helen, and two, they apply with the planning conditions that we've laid down in these two applications?
Well, the fence is a start, because it would clearly define the possible encroachment of the site into the haulage yard, and it would also mean that the vehicles would have to, from the waste site, only come out through here. And also we're recommending another condition requiring the operator to keep a log of their movements, which our enforcement team would be able to scrutinise and verify.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But, I mean, applicants have to comply with conditions, you know, and in the past, which we cannot take into consideration on these applications, but in the past they have not applied. And they've reading this, as I've read it over and over and over again the last few days, they've obviously just ignored the planning conditions.
It's all right. Okay. You are quite correct that you can't take it into account, and that has been put into the application. I can't obviously speak on behalf of the applicants as to why they have not done it, but from a point of view of enforcement action, we did take that action, and the report will state that because of the time, the temporary time period, and at the point at which the inspectorate got to look at it, they, if you like, just chose the easy option out and went with the fact that the permission had lapsed. Now that we are looking at it, we have to look at it from a land use planning point of view. The applicant could effectively sell it tomorrow to people that take absolutely every condition into account and they follow that. And that's what you have to look at. You have to assume that whoever the operator is, whether it's the existing operator or another one, they will adhere to it. And it will be at that point that if they don't, we will then take the appropriate action. And in the case of the EA's permit, they have actually already taken action in the past, and they have suspended the permits, and that is an immediate effect, whereas ours has a tendency to have to go through the long drawn-out process, which I know all members are aware of.
Yeah, thanks, but so they've had their permit suspended, but do they still work? Because according to this paper, I feel that they will ignore that and just carry on with it.
No, my understanding is when each time the permit has been suspended by the Environment Agency, it has stopped in those periods.
Yeah, thank you. I do believe that we owe a real duty of care to all the local residents. Yeah, and my question is to the officers, is there anything that we can do or say this afternoon by way of instruction or recommendation that will help you in your task?
Absolutely.
I think the important thing, and I'm sure Hannah will jump in if I'm saying anything out of turn, you can't assume that the applicant is going to continue to make breaches. You have to assume at this stage that they are going to take account of all the conditions and operate the site effectively. What you could, I suppose, do if you wanted to within those minutes is to say that in the event that the operator doesn't adhere to those, then you would like officers to investigate and move to enforcement action. But we can't monitor that because we don't know it's going to happen, and we all sit here hoping it won't happen. So you have to take the fact that the conditions have been put in there, and we've looked at the conditions very carefully, and one of the things that we've identified is we need to ensure that we have a clear divide within the sites, and that's why we're saying about that physical barrier. There will be a clear need for that. And if that isn't put in place, then straight away that will be one enforcement action that we will start looking into. But I have to assume at this stage, and I have no reason to disbelieve it, that the applicant will not adhere to those conditions, and that's the point that we have to go by.
I, of course, agree that we mustn't do that, but bearing in mind there is concern, whether rightly or wrongly, in the local neighbourhood, is there any way that, for example, a direct phone line could be set up between the local residents and officers so that there was a hotline? Because not that we don't believe the applicant, but the fact that we believe some of the local residents and we recognise their concerns.
I think we already have a direct email log that can come straight into the enforcement team to log any complaints, and that's what gets used. But again, I must stress that you have to assume that the applicants will adhere to all those conditions, and it's important, as with any site and with any permission, if I sat here and thought every single person wasn't going to do what they did, you'd never really want to give anyone a planning permission. So you have to take the assumption that they are actually going to do it. And at that point, if they don't, we will follow our enforcement plan. So when you were raising about the fact that we'd made reference to the fact there's no live planning application, our enforcement plan will say whilst ever there is an application in to be determined, then it would not be expedient to take action. So that's really where that was coming from as well.
Come a point where if they keep going on breaching different things, that the Environment Agency says enough is enough and we're closing you down? Or do they just have to treat every complaint individually and get them to deal with it, and it can go on forever?
Personally, I don't have the exact answer to that, but I know that when they're looking to issue permits, they can look at operator performance, unlike us. That said, I think there was a comment made by the Environment Agency in their response that their permit is one that remains unless it gets withdrawn from memory. So,
Yes,
so I don't think there's like any trigger clause or anything. But that's not to say that the Environment Agency don't have those powers. I'm just not aware of them.
That's paragraph 5.4, mate.
The fact that the current operator seems to be not operating it very well, it's presumably, we can't consider that. So we just have to decide, is this an appropriate use of a piece of an industrial estate? And I think one would have to conclude that it is.
Thank you, Chair. It is exactly the case, Joan. Is it suitable use for the land? And obviously it is, but I'm really, really, really concerned. This is one of those things, like last month or whenever it was, when we had to say yes to something I really didn't want to. And we couldn't say no because there was no material planning reasons to say no. So we are constantly sat here with our hands tied behind our back when we really, really want to do something to protect the residents, because they are the important people, the residents. And this tells me there's a lot of disquiet within the local area by the residents because of this operation on this land we're going to give permission to, or perhaps we'll give permission to. So I'd really like, if possible, Emma, I don't know if you could advise Emma or Hannah, could we insert sort of something to say we will vigorously make sure that our planning conditions are met and applied? Can we do that? And actually make sure we, you know...
Chair, could we instruct officers? Could we instruct officers that we make no judgment about the future compliance, but we have great concerns for the local. We have read and understood the residents' complaints, and therefore we instruct officers to keep a close watching eye on this and ensure total compliance.
Okay, I think we can probably agree to the first part of that, because the first part of that does actually note that exactly what I've been saying. You can't assume that there are going to be any breaches. But I think probably what the minutes can note is your concerns for the local residents and the local residential amenity, and that in the event that there were to be any breaches, then officers would follow their enforcement plan accordingly. No, because I think the point that I'm trying to make, Councillor Hunt, is that you're straying into the fact that you think they're going to do it. And I think it's very important that we follow due process, and we have to assume at this stage like you started, we have to assume at this stage that they are going to.
Said to me on the phone about a mooring point for a flying pig, but I can't.
If I could just come in, members, on that point, there are a couple of issues that arise. The first is that I wouldn't recommend that you're asking officers to effectively, proactively monitor the site, in the sense that there is case law where enforcement officers in the past have done that, and actually the courts have found that they're bordering on hampering and harassing people. So certainly I wouldn't be advising our enforcement officers to be undertaking weekly or fortnightly visits just to check if the conditions are being complied with. Our usual enforcement policy would apply, and that is that if complaints are received, they will be logged and recorded, and then they would be investigated. I would be very nervous about either a recommendation.
It's entirely your job and function to curb the enthusiasm of members, and entirely right that you guide us in that way, but I guess officers will get the feeling from members, which seems to be fairly universal, and that can somehow be got to officers' attention.
I mean, certainly if complaints are received, officers will investigate in accordance with the policies. And I'm very mindful as well that officers, of course, couldn't fetter their discretion. There are tests to apply when you're looking to take... If I could, sorry, just cut across you, Councillor, just as well to confirm that enforcement action is only taken if it's expedient to do so. And whilst I think the view from members here is that if the level of concern that has been raised previously carried on, members would think it would be expedient to take enforcement action. Certainly that's a test that officers would have to apply if they received complaints.
Like that is no doubt you're legally qualified.
Thank you. I wanted to just go back a little bit, only briefly, and if the officers would kindly just remind me. I find the point that's raised in item because it talks about the fact the original planning permission establishing the principle of development was granted, and the site was being operated under an exemption from environmental permitting regime. And can you remind me why any site operating a wood recycling thing would actually be operating under an exemption?
Chairman, as far as I know, the Environment Agency sets out exemptions from waste environmental permitting under a range of waste management activities, and there are sort of thresholds that they apply. And I think with wood waste, I don't know for sure, but one thing is I think the quantity. If you do it below a certain quantity, then you don't need a permit. And I think the type of the cleanliness of the wood. But I think those exemptions have a string of conditions attached to them. And so the Environment Agency, if they spot somebody is not complying with the terms of the exemption, they will say, you know, come on, you need to move into the permitting regime.
That's right. And is that why it now runs under with the Environment Agency permit, because it has gone over those original exempt thresholds, as it were? Okay.
Just quickly, I'm sorry, because this is our last two applications, I'd just like to thank Helen for her presentations, because the photos and the pictures are about the best I've seen in a planning committee, and it was very easy to understand, so thank you. Well, I did wonder how you got up there, yeah.
we have often found ourselves in these positions, and you yourself have commented on it, haven't you, in the past, where we are being required to make a decision on the basis of the land use, and yet we find out, and indeed Councillor Hudson has pointed out, we find ourselves uneasy about the fact that we may not duplicate the role of the regulatory authority, the Environment Agency. And that has often been a source of anxiety for us. But that remains the case. That is what we have to do, isn't it? And we have to just trust that the Environment Agency does its job as it should.
Good afternoon, everyone. The report before members provides an update on the work of the Enforcement and Monitoring Team from the 22nd of September to the 30th of November 2018. The report details all the complaints received in this period and their status at the time of writing, as well as the proactive monitoring of waste and mineral sites and the visits to non-chargeable and complaint sites that the team has undertaken. Paragraphs 8 to 14 of the report provide members with updates on some of the key enforcement cases. I've got 2 updates for members on cases where progress or action has been taken since the publication of this report. So, firstly, in relation to paragraph 8 of the report, which is about land adjacent to Sandfields Mill Road, Fen Drayton, the unauthorised use of that land as a waste site, a 3rd certificate of lawfulness application has now been submitted in respect of that land use. The application is not yet valid, and so I will update members again as and when it becomes valid and the determination is made. And then paragraph 10 of the report refers to the payment of costs incurred in obtaining the High Court order requiring the Council's consent to import any further waste onto land at Little Downham. The report states that the first payment was due for the costs agreed on the 1st of December, but following the publication of the report, the defendants raised a query in relation to VAT on the costs, and LGSS Law and the Council's finance team have now answered that query and then allowed a further period just until the 14th of December, which is tomorrow, for the payment of the first annual instalment towards the final figure that was agreed. I will update members further on whether that payment's been made at the next committee, regardless of whether there's an update report. And then just finally on that, we have just agreed with the communications team a press notice to go out in relation to those costs with a quote from the Councillor Connor as the normal chair of the planning committee. I don't have anything further to add on the report, but I'm happy to try and answer any queries that members may have.
Thank you, Chair. What can we do to ensure that this £11,500 is actually paid to us?
So we have recourse to the county courts if the payment is not made. We have agreed a 4-year payment schedule with interest. In fairness, there was a query with regard to VAT because a figure was agreed. It was 70. They were ordered to pay 75% of our total costs, but unfortunately the figure wasn't agreed at the High Court, and therefore we had to come back and negotiate that. We set out our cost schedule. They came back with an offer. In the interest of getting things resolved quickly, we said that is a reasonable offer, and we accepted it with the payment schedule. But following that acceptance, queries arose about VAT. And it's slightly beyond my expertise, but we have actually now clarified that, and we have all of the correspondence. So if, for some reason, come tomorrow, that payment isn't made and it's been set out in letters to the defendants, then we will go to the county court and we will go for the full 75% of the costs that were incurred, and can cite all the correspondence that we've had about being reasonable in this period.
First of all, I'd like to endorse your comments and your thanks. And if I could just clarify, so is it 11,500 plus VAT?
No, that was what the query was. The 11,500, there is no VAT, it's net, so there is no VAT payable on it. So this was, the query was that the defendants wanted to claim back their VAT, but we are not charging them VAT, and this is why it took a little while.
So VAT is not involved, so it's a net sum. It was 11,500. They've got to pay 11,500, and you know, so far he hasn't paid anything.
So far, but the 14th.
Yes, it's 4% above the base rate. Well, I wish you luck. I'm probably, Deborah, telling you to suck eggs, but you are aware, of course, of the sensitivities of block fen and the high profile and massive interest there is with local parish councils, and the rumours going around that, of course, it's now back in use and events are being operated there.
So that, obviously there is an item on Block Fen in the report, but I think what you're talking about is a different part of Block Fen. So there's Block Fen Drove and highway improvements is what's referred to in the report, but I assume that you're actually talking about a former quarry site that was Hanson.
I'm not totally up to all the geography around there. I'm just aware that when people complain and say there's more noises coming from that area. Well, maybe the fact that was mentioned here today but could be communicated to Councillor Bailey, who's a local district council member for that area.